What's up, everybody? It's your boy Spencer from Criminal Minds, aka Ezra from Pretty Little Liars, aka Mark Scout from Severance and the Teacher Flashbacks, aka Milo Thatch from Disney's Atlantis, aka the male Ellen DeGeneres, aka Johnny Depp's less insufferably self-obsessed but also far less attractive younger brother, aka Reed from Shameless Nerd. Today's video is about the tortured artist. Please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a like if you do end up liking it. I make weekly videos about all kinds of dorky stuff, from digital detoxing to classical philosophy to the weird actions of Andrew Jackson. You can also click the join button to become a member of the channel and get behind the scenes access to stuff and the satisfaction of knowing that you're supporting a rare public school teacher in the Southeast United States who's disinterested in teaching the Civil War as a states' rights issue. All right, let's get into it. Tragedy is beautiful. In sadness, in heartbreak, in darkness, there exists the ultimate mirror to humanity, the reflection of what it means to have feelings. If joy and peace is the ultimate good, necessary and balancing is the existence and the exploration of sadness. The most beautiful, powerful, transcendent stories that shape us and separate us from animals, are tragedies. Romeo and Juliet, Wuthering Heights, Macbeth, Kite Runner, Great Gatsby, Picture of Dorian Gray. I snuck that last one in. Movies like Titanic, Schindler's List, Requiem for a Dream, paintings like At Eternity's Gate by Van Gogh, The Old Guitarist by Picasso, albums like Either Or by Elliott Smith, Blue by Joni Mitchell, the single most gut-wrenching album ever written, A Crow Looked at Me by Mount Eerie, or my favorite album of all time that I'll do a whole video on later, The Midnight Organ Flight by Frightened Rabbit. All of these tragic, sad works of art are held in some of the highest regard in history, some admittedly more famous and culturally relevant than others, but you get my point. The greatest movie of all time, on any list you can find on the internet, the best novel of all time, the best album or play or TV show, whatever, will never be anything but a self-serious drama or a heavy introspection of an album or whatever. A comedy has won Best Picture 7 times, and while it's hard to decide exactly how many films fit the bill, a drama has won Best Picture at least 68 of the other 90 times there has been an Oscar for Best Picture. We think, or maybe intuitively feel, that stuff that is sad, stuff that reflects the difficulties of the human experience, is more important somehow, more valuable. And maybe it is. At minimum, that is a large portion of the value of art, the way that art can help us through tough times, can act as that mirror, can affect change, can be transformative in some way. And there's nothing intrinsically wrong with holding sad stuff in high esteem. I just said that my favorite album of all time is one of the saddest of all time. There's a song on that album about the narrator's own dead body floating down the River Forth in Scotland. The problem, and the main tenet of the central argument in this video, is about what has sort of accidentally happened as a result of this holding sad stuff in high esteem. Because as art has evolved, as what was introspective and explorative and cathartic has been commodified and mass-produced and become a mechanism by which people are catapulted into the public eye and revered as celebrities, or even less cynically, just as society has evolved to provide more information about the artists themselves, be them musicians or writers or actors or whatever, there has been a subtle, largely innocuous shift from idolizing art and being deeply curious about it, the complexities of the Mona Lisa, the symbolism and extended metaphor in Moby Dick, to idolizing artists and being deeply curious about them. What trauma Kurt Cobain must have lived through that drove him to write what he did, the tragedy of Eminem's early life and how that was incorporated into his music before he fell off the inevitable cliff all rappers seem to fall off in their early 40s, where they become unable to make good music anymore and instead start whining about a cancel culture that doesn't exist. But whatever. And this isn't to say that people weren't always interested in the stories of the artists they loved, and it isn't to say that people haven't always been curious about how life lived seeps into art made, but at some point, the two have become completely intertwined. And this is well documented in the incessant, inescapable, internet-only conversation about the idea of separating art from the artist that we're all forced to participate in against our will. At some point, a lot of art as a concept became selling a person as a story in a story, while selling the stories that person writes, if that makes any sense. And hearing it out loud, I'm not sure that it does. And again, at the risk of digression, which I know I'm prone to doing, that's also not intrinsically a problem. Being a fan of someone's art does kind of make you a fan of that person in a way, and that's fine. But in our praise of the tragic, in our infatuation with the sad, coupled with our idolization of the artist and the increasing inextricability of the person from the art they're making, we have inadvertently imposed a depression mandate on artists. If we expect an artist to make highly regarded, deep, interesting, thoughtful art about the the human experience, and we expect this artist to be prolific in doing so, and we expect that art to be reflective of the beauty in tragedy, what we're also doing is expecting the artist to live in that space forever. And being sad all the time, well, that's called depression. And I'm framing this as if it's a new idea because I'm trying to highlight our societal implication in it, but this isn't my idea. It's not conjecture. This is just true. In fact, we have words for this. The romantic ideal of the starving artist, an artist who prioritizes their creative pursuits over their financial well-being, often leading to a lifestyle of minimal income and material comfort, or the tortured poet who often finds solace in expressing pain, loneliness, and despair through creative outlets, often producing works of haunting beauty. The very word romanticization has only existed since 1906, coined by F.W. Kilbourne. We know that we're doing this culturally, societally speaking, even if we don't, like me and you, or we haven't thought of it until now. And the problem then, besides creating this weird pressure for artists to pigeonhole themselves as sad and perpetuate their own depression, is that we are creatures of correlation. Humans evolved to become a successful species because correlation is our superpower. We can create a tool to pull this rope so the branch comes down and we get the fruit. Ancient humans noticed that we might not be faster than the gazelle, but we can run farther for longer. And that pattern recognition, that innate ability to and inevitable notice of how things are connected is what makes us special. That's what makes us not gorillas. And in this context, that inherently human tendency toward correlation is not only harmful because we're inadvertently creating a connection between being depressed and making good art, and that's a pretty sad thing to pursue, being sad or believing in some weird value of pursuit of being sad, but it's also not actually correlated. Our morbid infatuation with and the visceral quality of these tragic stories we love of the tortured artists and their lives have created like a frequency illusion that has led us to believe that we need to be sad to make good art, or that an artist's being depressed or mentally ill is some secret authorial superpower that helps artists make good art, and that's just not true. John Green, author of one of the saddest and best young adult novels of all time, Fault in Our Stars, recently spoke about his troubles with depression and OCD, taking a long break from social media because, quote, "I guess in terms of my ability to do my job, there really are two issues. First, I need to finish this book so that it can come out next year, and that alone feels like it's too much work for my depressed brain. And second, to be honest with you, for a little over 9 months, I've just really struggled with making stuff now." Justin Vernon, whose music is released under the alias Bon Iver, whose debut album is often cited as one of the saddest and most gut-wrenching albums of all time, has often talked about the cycle of heartbreak, as he calls it, wherein after artists receive positive feedback on their sad stuff, they feel a push to repeat that cycle, and he tries not to do that. But interestingly to me, he doesn't even elaborate on what I think is the most important aspect of his perspective on the topic, that the music isn't the result of being depressed or being sad. The music is the result of overcoming it. Bon Iver was never even supposed to have a third album. He publicly expressed a permanent hiatus after the second album because, quote, "I had mental stuff I needed healing," he explains. And as morose or self-involved as it is, I felt that the only thing I could do was to go into myself a little bit. Depression, or even less pathologically, just like going through sad stuff, is not the superpower that allows artists to make even sad stuff. It keeps them from being able to do it. And frankly, I think it's a little reductive and silly to think that anyone should be more allowed or more trusted in discussing being sad, or recognizing what is sad in theory and then reflecting that in an art piece because they themselves have gone through tough times or haven't. For example, one of the most beautiful and haunting Victorian-era paintings I've ever seen, from an era famous for its haunting and beautiful paintings, is called The Bride of Death, painted by Thomas Jones Barker in 1839. It depicts a young woman on her deathbed in her wedding dress, her betrothed kneeling beside her in agony, weeping as the symbolic hourglass on her bedside table is seemingly now empty. It is beautiful, profound, inarguably well executed, tragic, and haunting. And I'm not an art critic and I know nothing, but thankfully for my argument, this painting is also highly regarded by actual art critics who know stuff about art. And guess what? He painted it as a gift to the youngest daughter of King Louis Philippe, or Felipe, I don't know, because she liked a poem that told a similar story, and he won a bunch of awards for it, and he was kind of a notoriously condescending, self-assured painter who found success in his own lifetime, which is super rare, for his works, and was kind of worshipped throughout his life, never wanting for much and having a, by all accounts, charmed life with very little struggle. He painted The Bride of Death when he was 26, having already found financial success by this point, and having met the King of France because they loved his artwork so much. And does his lack of struggle and depression and tragic backstory behind this painting really make it less beautiful or profound? Does the fact that this is a painting of a hypothetical situation and not a lived experience make it less tragic? Did we need Shakespeare to kill his dad to write Oedipus Rex, to kill himself to write Romeo and Juliet? This mythos of the tortured artist has become extremely pervasive. I had to sort of intellectualize my own consumption of that painting, The Bride of Death, after doing the research for this video, because in so doing, I found myself subconsciously like recontextualizing the painting and getting less out of it myself, finding less like profundity in it, despite it having made me cry in the past because of evidence I was trying to use to prove an argument that I believe in. And in that confrontation of my own internalization of this tortured artist problem, I realized that this actually is a problem. Like, that I myself believed in this myth in ways I wasn't conscious of, even while arguing that the myth was invalid and dumb. And I don't know, that's kind of scary to me. Like, how subconscious are our beliefs, our observations, our emotions? Oh God. Because this myth is dumb. It's not true. You don't have to be depressed to make good art, even good sad art. Researching this topic in terms of clinical studies and stuff like that is tricky. There have been a number of studies hypothesizing on both sides of the argument, seeking evidence that links creativity to mental illness for some reason, or seeking evidence that distances creativity from mental illness. And there have been studies that compile the data from those studies and come to different conclusions altogether. Studies about correlations between depression and creativity, psychopathy and creativity, schizophrenia, anxiety, bipolar disorder, the list goes on forever. And they're all over the place. I wrote the first part of this script in about 2 hours. I spent about a week and a half on the second part because I could not stop reading these studies trying to get to the bottom of this. Because worryingly, at first, there actually does seem to be some level of correlation between mental illness and creativity. So what I'm going to do is this. I'll link to all the studies I'm going to reference, as well as some that I just read as I was researching, and I'm going to give you what I think based on all the information that I read. Because if you want to, you can find an article detailing a study that claims that people diagnosed with bipolar disorder are 8% more likely to enter the arts, for example. You can also find an article detailing a study that claims there's actually a negative causal link between mental illness and creativity, for example. And then there's a bunch of stuff in between. So here's what I think based on what I found. I think there are two main issues that make this a really tangled and prickly thing to try to tease out and make a potentially seeming connection between the tortured and the artist actually misguided. So, spoiler alert, I don't think there is a connection. And they are what I'm going to call an apparency bias and an intuitive participation bias. So, one, apparency. The inherent problem in studying creativity or art is that it's subjective and that it takes many forms. Loading the dishwasher the way that I do, filling it up way beyond its intended capacity, that's very creative. That's art, in my opinion. And if you disagree with that, you'd fall right in line with my girlfriend, who also disagrees with me, of course. The issue, as concluded after a study by Dr. Andreas Fink published in the Psychonomic Society Journal, is that, quote, some cognitive features may be similar between creative and psychotic or schizophrenic-like thoughts. In other words, a lot of the time, so much that the authors of this study actually had to redirect their trial's purpose halfway through, a lot of the time creativity looks like mental illness, both like readily apparently and also like brain scan wise. You can read the article for all the mumbo jumbo, but basically psychosis can look similar to flow if you've ever been in like a flow state. Any of my friends could tell you that after I write and record a song and start talking about it, I certainly seem like I'm firmly in a state of psychosis. Another apparency bias is that a lot of the symptoms of mental illness, particularly depression and OCD, mirror certain aspects of exceptionally creative people's creative process. Locking yourself in a room for 2 weeks and emerging with a ragged beard and pants that no longer fit you looks the same as a depressive episode, except the latter emerges with pee bottles and the former emerges with an album. You can't separate these deeply ambiguous and convoluted similarities from each other unless you did elaborate diagnostic studies on every participant in a clinical trial, and doing so would be impossible. So instead, you do surveys. Do you self-isolate on occasion? Check. Have you been deeply sad recently for an elongated period of time? Check. Do you have a burst of energy followed by fits of lethargy and lack of motivation? Check. These things could be symptoms of depression, or they could be symptoms of the creative process, or they could be both, or they could be neither. And this is one of the main reasons why many of the studies in this area are criticized for being inconclusive. they are inconclusive. There's no way to make them conclusive. And from my perspective, what that tells me is that often artists are doing stuff that looks like depression or bipolar disorder. That's a big one for me personally, where I have these long periods of like manic creative output, and then I have these long periods of like where I just can't find the motivation to do anything. Or obsessive compulsive disorder, or take your pick. Because of this mythos we've already established and perpetuated culturally, there's an apparency bias. It's not deliberate or malevolent or something, but researchers who aren't explicitly studying these like false positives essentially are always going to see these behaviors as evidence of mental illness, or the opposite because of confirmation bias as to whatever they're pursuing in their study because of this apparency problem. The other issue is an intuitive participation bias, and by that I mean, simply put, that art is a great intuitive therapy for depression. So a lot of people who suffer from depression are making art because it helps them, myself included, with their depression. Writing in particular is super effective as a therapy, as known since at least a 1984 study by James Pennebaker, if not before that. And no one told us to do that. It's just intuitive. But that's the correlation, not the other way around. It isn't that an inordinate number of creative people happen to be depressed. It's that an inordinate number of depressed people are being creative. There's no real convincing evidence that becoming depressed makes you more creative, or that one's creative talent increases as one becomes depressed. I think that's a little silly if you think about it. Even at best, there is only this purported correlation, which is complicated by this participation bias. And anecdotally speaking, to be blunt, I was deeply depressed for much of my creative career, if you want to call it that. From the end of high school, when I started taking music seriously as a real creative outlet, through college when I continued doing that and started writing more seriously, painting more seriously, and took my first swing at a YouTube channel, they're all deleted, don't even try it, I was super depressed. I was also cripplingly anxious, which escalated to a point at which I was afraid to leave my house. It was really dark for a really long time. And throughout all of that time, I somehow still made a lot of stuff. I somehow was still kind of prolific in retrospect, given how dark it was for me. And I made a lot of stuff that I was proud of. I made a lot of sad stuff that helped me through a lot of those dark times. But in the past year and a half or so, as things have become way better for me mentally, and I am in the healthiest headspace I've been in as long as I can remember, to be honest. And I've made a few videos on that process if you're interested. In the past year and a half or so, I am so much more creative. I have more creative energy. I have more ideas. The ideas that I have are better and more interesting. I'm more prolific. I have greater depth in the things that I make. I feel like I have more to say. I've improved as an artist more drastically and more quickly. It's so much better. My depression wasn't making me a better artist. It wasn't making me more creative or giving me depth. I'm not thankful for having been depressed. We don't have to be thankful for the perspective it gave us or the things we learned from it. My depression was holding me artistically captive, in all honesty. You don't have to be depressed to make good art. You can be, and you can make great art. You can use art as a therapy for your depression. You can draw on that experience to make good art, but you don't need it. There's nothing romantic about the tortured artist. There's nothing flat or less profound about the artist who's having a good time. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to go sit in the dark and listen to one of the saddest songs ever written. Thank you for watching. See y'all next time. In this week's post-video video, I wanted to complain about Jalen Brunson. I realized that my target demographic interested in watching a 15-minute video about art, philosophy, and mental illness might not have a huge overlap with NBA basketball fans, but for the few of you that might exist in the same mental, weird-ass world that I live in, or who are willing to just listen to a grown man bitch about his favorite sports team, here we go. I am a Detroit Pistons fan. I live in the Southeast, but my family's from Michigan. Doesn't matter. Go Blue, go Lions, go Tigers, but I don't care about baseball. Basketball is my favorite sport. I like the way they dribble up and down the court, and I have waited my entire conscious life for the Pistons to be competent and competitive. Well, in the year of our Lord 2025, they finally are. And not only that, but they are led by a lovable, humble superstar in Cade Cunningham. They have a lovable, unfairly castaway coach in JB Bickerstaff. They have adorable found parts veterans like Malik Beasley, Tobias Harris, Dennis Schroeder, Tim Hardaway Jr. And they have one of the most interesting and wacky, bizarro players in the league in Asar Thompson. They're fun to watch. They play team basketball. They play defense. They play with heart. And they have the whole us versus them thing going on. And I just watched them beat the New York Knicks in a series they ended up losing in 6 games. No bullshit. I'm biased. I'm a homer, whatever. But the Pistons just won 5 games in a series they lost 5-2. And they were absolutely robbed by luck, big market referee bullshit, and the most unethical, foul-baiting, embarrassing player in the league, Jalen Brunson. I have watched basketball analytically, for I am a massive dork, since I was about 10 years old. I am sick. I watch regular season basketball games played by teams that I don't don't care about. And I have never in my life, without exaggeration, removing bias as much as possible, seen a more humiliating, embarrassing style of play than whatever the hell Jalen Brunson just did in this Pistons-Knicks series. If you are a fan of the Knicks, you should be ashamed of the way that your superstar is playing. I watched Jalen Brunson pretend to be hurt 7 different times in this series, 6 of the 7 times coming when his team was on the receiving end of an at least 8-point run. I watched Jalen Brunson cry and complain and pout and play dirty for every one of the 238 minutes he played in this series. And I watched Jalen Brunson avoid playing basketball in favor of solely trying to trick the referees into calling fouls in his favor, often to the detriment of his team, losing his team one game, on offense and defense on every single possession. I have never seen anything like it in my life, genuinely. I have not seen more effort put into playing pretend than whatever the hell Jalen Brunson just did and got away with for 6 games in this series. Not Manu Ginobili, not Joel Embiid, not James Harden, not Anderson Varejao or Chris Paul or Shane Battier. No player I have ever seen, even those most notorious for flopping or embellishing or whatever, none of them come close to what Jalen Brunson did in this series, and it's embarrassing, and it is bad for basketball, and yes, I'm salty and biased, but just watch a flop compilation from this series. It is insane, and I just love Dennis Schroeder. Let me grieve this loss in peace, okay? Goodbye. Love y'all.